The time has come, fellow cosmic explorers, to return to the Cosmic Chronicles podcast, where imagination meets reality and science fiction comes to life. I'm your host, Quinn. As always, you can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got a very special episode today, guys, going back all the way to the roots of science fiction. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Cosmic Chronicles, Season 2, Episode 1. I am your host, Quinn, and we are starting this new season off with a banger of an episode. We are going to go through the history of science fiction, from its ancient days and ancient Greek stories, all the way through the age of cyberpunk. Now, before we talk about the history of science fiction, let's try and define science fiction. Hugo Gernsback, often described as the father of science fiction. If you've ever heard of the Hugo Award, it was named for him. He started amazing stories way back in the 1920s. He described science fiction as a charming romance intermingled with scientific fact and prophetic vision. According to Webster's dictionary, on the other hand, science fiction is fiction dealing principally with the impact of actual or imagined science on society or individuals, or having a scientific factor as an essential orienting component. For a more complex definition, author Damien Broderick, in his 1995 book, Reading by Starlight, says that science fiction is that species of storytelling native to a culture undergoing the epistemic changes implicated in the rise and supersession of technical industrial modes of production, distribution, consumption, and disposal. This basically means that science fiction arises in cultures that are going through big changes of knowledge and technology that affect the way we live and work and interact in society. He goes on to say, it is marked by metaphoric strategies and metonymic tactics. Now, most people know what a metaphor is. Metonymic is a little bit more obscure. So, in a science fiction book, an alien species might be a metaphor for the other. That is a metaphor. As far as metonymy, just imagine a science fiction series where there are robots being produced on an assembly line. And in this context, this assembly line would represent the broader concept of robotic labor, mechanization, and the replacement of human effort with artificial systems. So there's a subtle distinction between a metonymy and a metaphor, and that is what this definition is pointing to. Google, on the other hand, puts it like this: fiction based on imagined future scientific or technological advances and major social or environmental changes, frequently portraying space or time travel and life on other planets. Again, more of a simple definition, and I would say less broad definition. There's also this guy named Darko Suvin, who said in his book, Positions and Presuppositions in Science Fiction, that science fiction is a literary genre of verbal construct whose necessary and sufficient functions are the presence and interaction of estrangement and cognition, and whose main device is an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment. This guy essentially identified what he called the novum. And the novum is the thing in a science fiction story that separates that fictional science fiction universe from the universe of the reader. And that novum can be the fact that it's set in the future in 10,000 years. That novum can be the existence of a spaceship, aliens, or it can be a conceptual novum, a different kind of existence. Maybe instead of a 3-dimensional world, we live in a 2-dimensional world. So this definition of science fiction depends on the idea of a novum. And I think this is a pretty valid definition. And I also think that there are a lot of different definitions, and it's something that people don't agree on. And I think this also goes into the debate of hard science fiction versus soft science fiction versus fantasy. But even though I think largely the definitions don't agree, I do believe that Darko Suvin captured something with his idea of the novum. I think Adam Roberts puts it most succinctly in his book, A History of Science Fiction. He says this after listing a bunch of different definitions of science fiction. There is amongst all these thinkers no single consensus as to what sci-fi is beyond agreement that it is a form of cultural discourse, primarily literary, but laterally increasingly cinematic, televisual, comic book, and gaming. That involves a worldview differentiated in one way or another from the actual world in which the readers live. So he goes back to the concept of the novum. At the heart of science fiction, there is a novum which exists, and that's basically what everyone agrees on. So now that we've given some definitions of science fiction, let's get into the history of science fiction. Now, people often talk about Lucian's A True Story as one of the first science fiction stories, and I've discussed this before, and I will be discussing all of this in more detail in my upcoming documentary on Quinn's ideas about the history of science fiction. This podcast episode is really just a small precursor to that video. While I do think that Lucian's A True Story has elements that, when you posthumously look back upon them, appear as science fiction, I think that primarily it is a satirical and fantastical work. The real roots of science fiction lie, in my opinion, and in the opinion of Adam Roberts, who wrote A History of Science Fiction, in the Protestant Reformation. And this was around the 16th century in Europe. And this would go on to affect the world, science, and thus science fiction. Now, it didn't all happen at once. It happened at varying rates throughout Europe, and there was a lot of resistance to the Protestant Reformation. But essentially what occurred was a shift in the way people thought about God and their relationship to the natural world and God's relationship to the natural world. It started to change, and it started to move towards reason and away from magical thinking. It's not that people stopped believing in God. People just had this idea that we now come to God through reason. We now come to God through rationality. Through observing nature and coming to know nature, we come closer to God. And science fiction essentially grew out of this ancient Catholic tradition of magical, fantastical, mystical storytelling that then buds into a Protestant tradition of fantastic, magical, and mystical storytelling, but with an added thing. We are now reacting to the new sciences. We are now reacting to the new technologies that are developing. The Protestant Reformation created conditions that were conducive to the development of modern science, and thus science fiction. Now, what is interesting about this fact that science fiction was born into this dialectic between mysticism and techno-rationalism, is that this dialectic never left science fiction. If you even just look at some of the names of the pulp magazines that we're going to talk about in a little bit that made science fiction popular in the 1920s and the 1930s. Amazing science fiction, wonder stories, fantastic stories. The dialectic remained throughout science fiction's existence and resprouted in the 1960s. But as I said, we'll talk about all of that later. Now, when I use the word dialectic, what I basically mean is that science fiction is often trying to reconcile the two things: spiritualism, mysticism, magic, and techno-realism and rationalism and reason. And this is science fiction at its core is often philosophical, and it's dealing with questions of transcendence and atonement. Think of Dune. Think of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Think of Heinlein's A Stranger in a Strange Land. Because of these roots of science fiction in the magical and the fantastic, and its dialectic with techno-rationalism, it never died. It remained, and it rebutted at a later point in time. But we're going to start by talking about the Romantic era. So, Mary Shelley is widely accepted as to have created the first actual science fiction novel with Frankenstein, 1818. And Frankenstein was born out of the Romantic era. And this is a period that reacted against the Industrial Revolution's rapid technological advancements and the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and science. And the Enlightenment grew from the conditions left behind by the Protestant Reformation. The Romantic movement prized emotion, nature, and imagination, often as a counterbalance to what many people saw as the cold, mechanical logic of science. And so Shelley's novel emerged from this tension. And again, we're continuing the tradition of science fiction as expressing this dialectic, this fundamental dialectic, remember this, between mysticism and techno-realism and rationalism. It never fully goes away. It's even in the first actual science fiction novel, not just proto-science fiction stories born out of the Reformation. So Shelley wrote this novel during a summer in Geneva, and she famously spent it with other writers and thinkers like Percy Shelley and Lord Byron. The story reflects the growing anxieties of her time, the fear that scientific discovery, for all its promise, might be driven by ambition and recklessness, ignoring the emotional, moral, and spiritual dimensions of human existence. So this was at a time when electricity, chemistry, and anatomy were essentially transforming medicine and industry. But these advancements also raised unsettling questions about humanity's power and whether or not we were playing God, whether or not we're wielding the power of God. Now, this is the essential theme of Frankenstein. In Frankenstein, she explores this dialectic between mysticism and science, as I said, through Victor Frankenstein on his quest to create life. So on one hand, Victor represents the scientific drive for discovery. His obsession with uncovering nature's secrets and transcending morality embodies the era's optimism for human potential. Yet, his failure to anticipate the emotional and ethical consequences of his actions demonstrate the danger of scientific hubris. He rejects his creation. He can't bear to look upon it, and this causes a lot of agony in the creature. The creature itself is a product of unnatural creation, but embodies a liminal space between science and mysticism. It's alive through scientific means, but profoundly isolated. The creature is constantly yearning for meaning and connection. So, through this story, Shelley is warning us that science without a guiding moral or spiritual compass risks creating monsters, both literal and metaphorical. From Shelley, we move on to Jules Verne. Jules Verne wrote during the 19th century, and this is a time, like I said, that's marked by profound technological innovation and colonial exploration and a fascination with the natural world. So the age of steam, essentially, had connected continents through railroads and steamships, and scientific expeditions were ventured into uncharted territories. This would also go on to inspire writers like H.P. Lovecraft. So we were cataloging new species, we were mapping the earth. Verne's novels reflect the optimism of this era and the spirit of exploration and adventure of this era. Because it really was an era that celebrated human ingenuity and the possibility of mastering the mysteries of nature through technology. So 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea came out in 1870, and it essentially exemplifies this spirit. In the series of stories, you follow Captain Nemo and his advanced submarine, the Nautilus, on a journey beneath the waves. And these stories were meant to capture the wonder of discovery and also weave scientific descriptions of the adventure and mystery. And so they were more like imaginative, escapist reflections on the period's fascination with progress. But also, Verne also questions the limits of scientific exploration, particularly when unmoored from the ethical considerations. Captain Nemo, for instance, is a genius and a master of technology, and he embodies this conflict. While the submarine is a marvel of scientific achievement, no doubt, his rejection of society and his vengeful use of his creation suggest a darker side to human invention. The ocean itself, also as this vast and mysterious realm, serves as a counterpart to the precision of the Nautilus. So Verne's descriptions evoke a sense of awe and mysticism and remind readers that even with all of our scientific advancements, the natural world still retains this enigmatic power that will resist at all times full understanding. So the stories kind of then become this meditation on how science and exploration can enrich human life while also deepening, I guess, recognition of its mysteries. So from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne, 1870, we move on to The War of the Worlds, 1898. H.G. Wells wrote this at the turn of the 20th century. And like we've been talking about, this is a time period when science is rapidly transforming everyday life, and it's reshaping humanity's understanding of its place in the world and in the universe. This is around the time of Darwin's theory of evolution. Like, it's already challenged traditional religious views, while advances in astronomy and physics have expanded the scope of the known cosmos. Everything's becoming bigger and more complex and more confusing. Wells was fascinated by these developments, but also wary of their implications. The War of the Worlds captures, I would say, the uncertainty of this era. It imagines a Martian invasion that upends humanity's dominance on Earth, essentially. The novel plays on Victorian anxieties, I think, about imperialism and technological dependency and, you know, the fragility of human civilization in the face of superior forces. Through the War of the Worlds, Wells is essentially examining the uneasy interplay between science and mysticism yet again, because the Martians, with their advanced technology and merciless efficiency, represent the apex of scientific development. They are detached, cold, utilitarian. Their overwhelming power forces humanity to confront its own vulnerability. It strips away any illusion that science guarantees control over nature. And at the same time, the novel's ending, which, I mean, some people would call it Deus Ex Machina, because it kind of is. Essentially, the Martians are undone by bacteria because they hadn't adapted with the bacteria of Earth. So they all start dying suddenly. This, in a way, suggests a return to mysticism. It highlights that there are enduring mysteries of life that science cannot yet conquer. So you essentially, from this point, you have the big bang in the 20th century. So we're going to start with Edgar Rice Burroughs. So Edgar Rice Burroughs starts with The Princess of Mars. It was serialized. This is even before Amazing Stories. This was serialized in a magazine called The All Story, and it wasn't even exclusively science fiction. In fact, there was no exclusive science fiction magazine until 1926's Amazing Stories, started by Hugo Gernsback. Princess of Mars is very interesting because while it has a bunch of technological novums that ground it squarely in the realm of science fiction, it still carries with it this fundamental sense of mysticism. In the first story, John Carter doesn't get to Mars in a spaceship. He doesn't get to Mars by teleportation. He goes to Mars by going and looking at the stars and willing himself to Mars, essentially wishing himself to Mars. And by will alone, he is brought to Mars. So it's really interesting because I watched the film adaptation recently because I'm doing a lot of research about the history of science fiction. I watched the Disney one from a few years ago, and in that sequence, they have him get a hold of this teleportation device that this alien has, and that's how he teleports to Mars. So it was interesting that in the 21st century movie remake, this element of mysticism that is present in the original story is removed in favor of a technological novum. It's very interesting, and I wonder if it has something to do with the shifting ways that we see science fiction over time. A lot of our perceptions of what science fiction is has to do with a lot of these early editors of science fiction magazines. We'll start with Hugo Gernsback. As I said, he started Amazing Stories in 1926, and his idea was that he wanted to get rid of all of the elements of mysticism and magic in science fiction, and he wanted the hardest of the hardest science fiction, even though he called it scientific at this point in time, because the term science fiction wasn't widely used. So his idea was that science fiction at its core needed to be fundamentally didactic. He needed it to teach something about science or engineering, and that's all he really cared about. And a lot of critics and historians have looked back on this, and they've accused him, or accredited him, I should say, with the infantilization that occurred in science fiction. Essentially, because of his style of editing, a lot of the stories that came out of Amazing Stories around that time had this dry sense, and they were prone to phony science. And as long as they had this allure of being didactic, no matter how bad the science was, it would get published. And so some of the science inside of these magazines ultimately ends up being quite silly. And over time, as more magazines bud out, you eventually have Wonder Stories, which was also a creation of Hugo Gernsback. And you also have Astounding Science Fiction, which comes into prominence under editor John Campbell. You have them kind of being viewed as amazing is kind of for kids. And then Wonder Stories is for teenagers. And then Astounding Science Fiction, this is where the adults go. And Astounding Science Fiction, as I said, really takes off in the late 1930s when John Campbell comes on. And that's when we're introduced to the likes of Isaac Asimov, Heinlein, eventually L. Ron Hubbard, creator of Scientology, even makes an appearance at some point. Campbell actually gets his start as a writer of, Gernsbackian style science fiction. But when he takes over Astounding Stories, his vision is not completely in line with the Gernsback vision. Essentially, he does want the stories to be logically consistent. He wants them to be based in some sort of scientific rationale. But he wants to focus on, heroes, solving problems, and adventure. He wants more of an emphasis on telling a good story and less on the didactic element that is less necessary for him. But still, Campbell's editorial style was said to be pretty restrictive. He would sometimes rewrite things himself. He would often demand that authors rewrite things. He famously rejected Asimov at age 19, 9 times before he finally accepted one of his stories. So Campbell was an extremely involved editor, and he had no qualms about just straight up rejecting stories. This editorial style was much less common outside of science fiction, and also the magazines outside of science fiction paid more than science fiction magazines, which is why a lot of the science fiction that was actually published between 1920 and 1930 was actually outside of science fiction only magazines because they paid more. In fact, something like 60% of the science fiction published during the Gernsbackian days and the Campbell days was outside of their influence. Now, I think this goes on to change more for Campbell as we shift into the golden age of science fiction. Because I think a lot of people would say that the golden age of science fiction is actually the Campbellian age of science fiction because he actually had so much influence. And a lot of great science fiction came out of this era. For instance, Jack Williamson, super underrated, Legion of Space series. Jack Williamson was one of the creators of the space opera genre, along with, Doc Smith and Edmund Hamilton. In the Campbellian era, you have the publishing of Asimov's most famous classics, Nightfall, which is a great, great book about this society that always has some form of sunlight because their planet is got multiple suns. But then they eventually realize that every 2,000 years, civilization collapses because all the suns set. And if you've read the Three Body Problem series, that's probably ringing a couple of bells to you. And then also, the Foundation series is serialized in this period of time. And also the Robot series, which I think I've come over time to develop more of appreciation for the Robot series than perhaps even the Foundation series. And I understand how influential, and no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, foundational the Foundation series is, but the Robot series also does so much for the way it creates this idea of these Kantian robotic entities, because this is something that Adam Roberts talks about in his book, A History of Science Fiction, as well. Robots in Asimov's series follow the 3 laws of robotics, and I'm sure you've heard of that before. The 3 laws of robotics are: a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. As Adam Roberts argues in his book, Asimov has created robots that operate based on a Kantian system of ethics. In the most basic description, Kantian ethics appeal to absolute morality. If it is wrong to lie, then it is wrong to lie in all instances, no matter the case. If it is wrong to kill, then it is wrong to kill in all instances. The robots in Asimov's series do not appeal to their consciousness when considering making a decision as humans would. They appeal to the 3 laws of robotics at all times. It is a Kantian system. And I think it's so interesting how much comes out of this. Those 3 laws would seem to limit their behavior in many, many ways, but a lot comes from this system, and there's so many incredibly interesting stories that come out of this. And I think Asimov's vision of robots has been extremely influential, and it's done a lot to help the perception of robots, who are often demonized in science fiction. And this is something that I'm going to get into more in the documentary. This relates back to, Plato and his views on these concepts, episteme and techne, basically knowledge or philosophy and reason versus skill, tools, and technology. Essentially, tools, technologies, skills are seen as inferior, seen as obscuring the truth, seen as ersatz and fake. And robots fall under techne. And essentially, this form of thinking leaked into science fiction, you could say. We'll get into that, like I said, more in the documentary. That's a very basic, simple, not very in-depth explanation of it. The Golden Age saw the flourishing of so many incredible authors. You had C.L. Moore, Catherine L. Moore, a fantastic author of fantasy and science fiction. You had A.E. Van Vogt. You had Ray Bradbury with the Martian Chronicles in 1950. Alfred Bester, of course. We've talked about his book, The Star Is My Destination, several times on the Quinn's Ideas channel. Of course, Arthur C. Clarke, Childhood's End, 1953, is one of my favorite science fiction stories. It is a really interesting one, and it's definitely one that continues that dialectic that has remained with science fiction between mysticism and, science and techno-rationalism. That is a big part of what this story is about. If you don't know what Childhood's End is about, essentially you have the overlords, this alien race. They come to Earth and they say they're going to help us. And they do help, essentially. But when they show themselves, they essentially look like demons. And there is a rationale as to why they look like demons, or better yet, why we have the image of demons in our head that we do, but we're not going to get into all that. The key theme in this book here is transcendence. At the end of the book, the human race transcends, but a lot of people have said there's two different ways to look at the story. You can either view it as a happy ending where the human race transcends and moves beyond its physical coil, or you can view it as a story about this abstract, formless entity of thought that consumes the earth and all its consciousness. So that's the darker interpretation. I tend to go with that it's about transcendence because that's a theme that appears in other works of Arthur C. Clarke, particularly his collaboration with Stanley Kubrick, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which, comes in the new wave of science fiction, which we'll get into right now. So the new wave of science fiction, I think, comes as a reaction to Campbellian science fiction, which over time becomes restrictive. And also Campbell, great editor, but he kind of becomes partial to pseudosciences towards the end. He gets into Dianetics a bit. And he gets into the pseudoscience. He begins to alienate more and more people. So over time, newer magazines start to form. Like Galaxy magazine starts to form. So there's newer magazines that are open to wider stories, different types of stories. That wasn't the entire reason that the new wave formed. The new wave kind of formed, I think, as a reaction to the restrictive feeling and the stale feeling that science fiction had developed the previous 50 years. And a lot of the new wave represented this big return in a big way to the original dialectic that originally formed science fiction. I think Dune is a huge example. I think that Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land is a huge example. I mean, Dune is pretty much known for the fact that it is one of the greatest science fiction stories ever, but also for the fact that it incorporates elements of the mystical that is fundamental to the story, the dialectic between mysticism and science. Through prescience, this mystical power, Paul can see the future, but he has to use technology still to meet the ends. He still has to wear a still suit. Ultimately, to defeat the Emperor, he has to use atomics. The novums in Dune are not just technological and conceptual, they're also mystical. Samuel R. Delany is a lesser known but definitive author in this time period as well. Babel 17 is one of the precursors for cyberpunk. William Gibson, who is later known as the father of cyberpunk, the guy that created Neuromancer, was a big fan of Samuel R. Delany. Babel 17 is about this poet and starship captain who investigates a mystery language that's being used as a weapon in an interstellar war. And the story delves into the power of language and communication and how they shape human perception and identity. Neil Stephenson does the same, does a similar thing, plays with a similar idea in his later cyberpunk book, Snow Crash. Samuel R. Delany's 1968 book, Nova, is often also seen as one of the precursors to science fiction as well. In the new wave, you also have Ursula K. Le Guin come into prominence. Left Hand of Darkness came out in 1969. The Dispossessed was 1974. Left Hand of Darkness is a good example of a science fiction book that uses a conceptual novum. The main novum in Left Hand of Darkness is the fact that there is this group of people that can change their gender whenever they want, at will, like, basically. And there are technological novums, there's spaceships, there's technology, but the key novum is still conceptual. J.G. Ballard is also an author that comes to prominence at this time. In another video on Quinn's Ideas, we talked about his book, High Rise, which takes place in this kind of dystopian future where people live in these high-rise building societies where the rich live in luxury at the top. If you've ever seen movies like Snowpiercer, The Platform, all of these I think are somewhat inspired by J.G. Ballard's High Rise. One thing that was also happening during the New Wave that was changing stories was that people's trust in the government was waning. People's trust in society was waning. People's trust in our ability to solve our problems was waning. At this point, humankind had lived through 2 world wars, and one of which saw the creation of the atomic bomb. A lot of stories had elements of dystopian futures destroyed by nuclear weapons, stories in which we just didn't make it, stories in which we destroyed the wondrous society that we once had. Canticle for Lebowitz is about this, 1960, Walter J. Miller. Nukes, while they represent, in a way, this pinnacle of human ingenuity and technology, we could power entire cities with this technology. It also represents our destructive capability, our ability not only to destroy ourselves, but the world. This is what a lot of post-war stories were dealing with. And, you go into the New Wave and you add the Cold War to things, and you have then the birth of Cyberpunk, where we have full-on dystopian fiction. And what this fiction reflects is that we no longer have faith in our institutions to have our best interest at heart. We no longer have faith in our government to protect us. Neuromancer depicts a world where our governments have allowed corporations to build up so much influence and wealth that they are now more powerful than the governments themselves. Individuality is devalued. Human life is devalued. William Gibson in Neuromancer paints a picture of the future that is not only terrifying, but it seems like the more we go on, the more familiar it becomes. William Gibson creates so many tropes and ideas as well that become staples of science fiction. The idea of cyberspace. I don't know if even the technology of VR would be what it was if William Gibson hadn't written these books first and made people think about it. And this is something that we're going to talk about in detail in my History of Science Fiction video. But there was this guy, Paul Feyerabend, who had this view of science. And what Paul Feyerabend's view of science says implicitly about science fiction, without telling you what the view is, because we don't have time to go into that in this podcast. It says implicitly that science fiction, in some way, well, in the Feyerbendian sense, is a form of science, actually, because science fiction involves setting up a model and extrapolating from that point on. Now, this is, of course, at odds with the Russellian view of science fiction, which we will also get into in the documentary, of course, which is more in line with the way modern science is really done today. But it is food for thought. And if you're interested in that, definitely look into it. And I would recommend, again, Adam Roberts' book on the history of science fiction. So as I was saying, because of William Gibson's Neuromancer, and I think also because of Blade Runner, which was based off of Philip K. Dick's book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, though that book itself isn't cyberpunk, in my opinion. I think that cyberpunk is one of the key subgenres inside of science fiction. So a lot of cyberpunk books get published throughout the 80s and the 90s. Walter John Williams, Hardwired, Pat Cadigan's Signers, Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, which is kind of satirical in a lot of ways, but also it just seems like the real world that we're living in a lot of ways. So I would say that by the mid 90s, for sure, cyberpunk is essentially developed as a real genre. Its tropes are essentially solidified by that point. And then you, of course, have The Matrix in 1999. Forgive me, I know I haven't really been talking about movies as much in this podcast because our focus is really literature and science fiction. But if I mention The Matrix, I should go on to say that there is something that happens during the new wave that doesn't really involve the new wave. It happens independent of the new wave that does a lot for science fiction. This is another big bang in science fiction. And that was the release of Star Wars 1977, because now Star Wars goes to the real mainstream. And even in the golden age of science fiction wasn't mainstream in the sense that it is today. But then Star Wars happens and science fiction is for the entire family. So it really cannot be understated the impact that Star Wars has on science fiction as a genre from that point on, as far as moving it into the mainstream and putting it in front of everybody's eyes. I would go as far as to say that science fiction literature wouldn't even be as popular as it is today without Star Wars. How many kids watched Star Wars for the first time and then picked up their first science fiction book, their first Asimov book, their first Heinlein Arthur C. Clarke story? Interestingly enough, the spirit of Star Wars, I think, is a direct lineage from the spirit of some of those earlier pulpy science fiction stories that were adventure-based, such as Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars series. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that Star Wars continues the ancient tradition of science fiction in being about this dialectic between mysticism and techno-realism. The Force is the mystical element that is throughout the Star Wars series. We don't pay attention to the midichlorians thing. We don't think about that. We don't think about that because fundamentally what this is referring to is that dialectic. That is at the heart of it. And since we brought up The Matrix as well, The Matrix does this same thing. The Matrix is very concerned with atonement, transcendence, saviors, messiahs, continuing the tradition. It's a part of science fiction, and I'm pretty sure it always will be, because the questions that are being asked are rooted within us. You know, why are we here? What is the nature of our existence? What is the nature of the world around us? These epistemological questions that fill us essentially define our humanity. All right, so we've gotten through it. We've gone through the history of science fiction. Of course, we haven't covered everything. Like I said, I'm working on a 3-hour documentary right now, and it might be even longer than that, to try and get to what the heart of science fiction is and explain its history. I've read at least 3 science fiction history textbooks at this point, as well as biographies, short stories. I've learned a lot about the history of science fiction, and I'm continuing to learn more, and I'm looking forward to sharing everything with you guys. All right, so it looks like that's a wrap up on episode 1 of season 2 of Cosmic Chronicles. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. If you're listening on YouTube, please hit the like button. It really helps out with the algorithm. You can also subscribe to the podcast feed and check out our social media, all links in the description.